I recently spoke with media entrepreneur Arianna Huffington, and she's one of 140 global activists that signed an open letter to world leaders this week, urging them to address issues of inequity for women. And when we talked, I began on what motivated her to join that letter.
Well, I think it is incredibly important to realize how, despite all the emphasis in our debates and in our media on achieving gender parity, on achieving education for all girls around the world, we're nowhere near where we need to be, either in the developing world where millions of girls are still denied education, or here in the States and in other developed countries where we still don't have all the women we need to have on boards, in corporate suites, etc. So about 140 women came together to pen this letter asking for change. And one of the things we did is we called poverty sexist, because poverty even affects women and men differently.
And what would you like world leaders to do? And let's start, we're right in the United States. Should there be laws and policies around diversity and inclusion that aren't there today?
Well, right now, we're at the moment where corporations are actually changing their own cultures. There's a huge prioritization of diversity and inclusion over the last year. I think what people are realizing that diversity and inclusion are not just nice to have, they're not just kind of the icing on the cake. They affect the entire culture, and we are beginning to recognize that a company's culture is a company's immune system. So when it's not healthy, when it's not diverse, when it's not inclusive, it ultimately affects the bottom line.
One company that you influence quite directly, Uber, has a disproportionate showing of men in the tech jobs, a problem across the spectrum when it comes to technology jobs. What's your messaging internally at Uber?
Well, internally, a lot of changes have been made at Uber, including most recently last week. Uber was the first company to allow victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment to be able to go to court rather than into forced arbitration, and to be able to speak about their experiences instead of being forced to keep everything confidential once an agreement is reached. And at the same time, and that was pretty unprecedented, Uber announced that it was going to be transparent and release data around sexual assault and sexual harassment, which is going to make a huge difference in the transportation industry. Already Lyft followed suit, and is also part of Dara Khosrowshahi's, Uber's new CEO, message of prioritizing safety as well as prioritizing diversity and inclusion.
Is there also new pressure from the board to turn Uber's focus to profitability as well as these other cultural issues?
No, there's no pressure on that at all. The board has complete confidence in Dara and in the timeline he has set out for the company to have an IPO and for the company to continue growing. I think Uber has been an amazing hyper-growth story, and Dara is committed to continuing growth both globally and growth in terms of new innovation in autonomous vehicles, etc.
Can you give me your perspective on the atmosphere globally, doing business from America, given trade protectionism, given some of the rhetoric on the geopolitical side? Is it getting more difficult?
Well, yes, it definitely is getting more difficult. I think we have obviously a White House and a president that conducts policy through tweets, and messages keep changing. Right now, for example, our whole approach to China has changed. It started with being very confrontational and very much about tariffs. Now it's changing, and the president suddenly is worrying about jobs in China. This is definitely a pretty unprecedented moment in American politics that we are all trying to deal with. And at the same time, the good news that it has led to an incredible amount of activism, more young people registering to vote, galvanized both by what's happening in Washington and especially by what's happening in our schools with the latest tragedies of gun violence and deaths. So it's a moment when multiple forces have been unleashed, both for bad but also for good. And it's particularly exciting as the mother of two millennial daughters to see millennials finally being galvanized.